Hi, I'm Conor Byrne, and this is That's What I Call Marketing, the podcast where you would hear from the leading lights in the marketing world and listen to their unique insights. Well, if you listened to radio anywhere in the UK or Ireland in the 90s, you would have heard the dulcet tones of Dusty Rhodes, and he is my guest today on That's What I Call Marketing. Dusty started on Pirate Radio Sunshine 101 and joined Atlantic 252 before moving to Irish radio station 2FM, where he broke listenership after listenership record and hosts the renowned and famous Hotline Show. Dusty was always a bit of an early adopter, helping launch 2FM's first website in the early 1990s. So it comes as no surprise to hear that in 2006, Dusty was one of the first to get into podcasts. Having done it for so long, Dusty knows a thing or two about how to make great audio for the podcast age. So as someone who podcasts, I often get asked, well, why or when should a brand get into podcasts? So instead of me saying what I think, as per usual, I go to the best in the business. Dusty has just completed a comprehensive analysis of global award-winning podcasts. And so he joins me today to discuss all of that, all of the learnings from it, and tell you what you need to know as a brand owner if you are thinking about starting your own podcast. Don't forget to subscribe to That's What I Call Marketing, wherever you are listening or watching, so you know when our next episode lands. And if we can help you with your growth through marketing, visit that'swhaticallmarketing.com and see how we can help. Today's episode of That's What I Call Marketing is brought to you by the Indie List, Ireland's leader for freelance marketing, creative and digital talent. The Indie List provides easy access to hundreds of highly experienced and vetted experts across the marketing services business, quickly and cost effectively. You can check out their full range of services at indielist.ie. Dusty, thanks a million for joining me on That's What I Call Marketing. Great to have you here.
Good to be here.
Listen, first of all, to avoid any confusion, who maybe people who are big WWE fans, you're no relation to Dusty Rhodes. He's passed away, so you're definitely not him. But anyway, no relation to a WWE star.
No relation whatsoever. Actually, when he passed away, you wouldn't believe the amount of text messages I got. People just don't pay attention anymore. Like,
Yeah.
With WWF wrestling star Dusty Rhodes passed away, and they just, is he okay? No, so
listen, for people who are listening, who may not be familiar with you, can you give me just a brief introduction, and then I want to get into the background, because people in Ireland will know the name Dusty Rhodes. But let's start with what you're doing right now, and then we'll go back.
Okay. Well, at the moment, podcasting for brands is my thing. It all started off when I was a teenager and I got into radio in a big way. It was always my ambition to do that. I started working on pirate radio stations at 13, got into National Radio 21, spent about 15 years with RTE, after which I started my own audio production company. And we ended up making radio programs for practically every radio station in the country, picking up a load of PPI awards and IMMA awards along the way.
Yeah.
And then around COVID time, we decided to just focus on podcasts exclusively, and also on podcasts specifically for brands. The reason being that brands share the same kind of high standards that I would have, because national radio is my standard. So I wanted to continue working at that standard. So that's why we work with brands today.
And you just going back a little bit, because you worked on some, like, I guess, iconic stations like Sunshine, Atlantic 252, RT 2FM. Was it just 2FM there? And then there was the Hotline as well. You hosted that. So like, these were big, shows. I mean, Atlantic 252 was huge UK listenership as well.
Yes. Atlantic was interesting. A lot of people may have heard of Radio Luxembourg.
Yeah.
And they had ambitions to get into the UK with a daytime signal. So they teamed up with RTE to create this station called Atlantic 252, which was based in Trim in County Meath, but broadcast to the United Kingdom. So in theory, the license was to broadcast to Ireland with a little overspill in the UK. So, and it meant we had that little kind of a pirate radio vibe, because nobody knew who regulated us. I mean, we were licensed by the Irish authorities, but the content was for the UK. So it was obviously the UK's problem. And then if anybody complained to what we were doing to the UK authorities, they'd go, well, it's an Irish station. I would go through. So we never got into it. We did some wild things. There was I remember one in particular was there was a protest at Strangeways Prison in Manchester
Oh,
one
yeah, I
summer,
remember that.
and we heard that the prisoners were on the roof with a radio and listening to us.
Yeah. God, I
So I
remember that.
played a request for them, and
Gosh. Did
I
you?
fought law, and the law won.
That's
No,
brilliant.
nuts. And then RTE was terrific. Um, the Hotline was a program. It was kind of for kids, a request show for kids, and it was known as the fastest hour of the day because it was
That's
all
right.
wham, bam, 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 bam. And when they offered it to me, I was in the middle of getting a project together for the 75th anniversary of the Air Corps. So I pitched the idea to the producer. I said, okay, the Hotline's the fastest hour of the day. What if I presented the show from the cockpit of an Air Corps jet flying at the speed of sound across the country? And the producers go, oh my God, that would be amazing if you could organize it. And I went, well, guess what? I have. And he's like, so that's how we launched the hotline. Just playing requests from the cockpit of the
Oh
airport.
my God.
Across the country. It was insane. And then to end it all off, a moment I will never forget was just before we landed. We decided to buzz the tower, so you're flying very high speed past the control tower of Baldonnel. And just for added interest, we did it upside down, inverted.
Oh my God. Oh
So
my God.
yeah,
Yeah.
I've had a bit of fun in my day.
Yeah. Yeah. Right. Like radio's it's a tough business.
Oh,
I was working with some of the radio stations in the UK and Ireland doing these radiothon fundraisers for like 3 days. They gave over their airtime and it was really unique thing. And we had loads of evidence actually that it connected the listeners to the radio station in a different way. Like it was phenomenal because they were telling stories in a different way for the first time.
yeah. Well, there's something about radio where radio is one of the most trusted mediums.
Yeah.
And there's something about where, I think it's a little to do with the fact that you cannot see people, that you have to have a picture of them in your head. And because of that, there's an even stronger connection. And I would meet people all the time and they would say, oh, blah, blah, blah. They'd know things about me that I had just like
Yeah.
barely mentioned. I
Yeah.
was in Kerry one day. Ah, Dusty, how are you doing? How's your brother Paul? I says, oh, he's great. Do you know him? I know, but you mentioned that he worked in Dunn's in Tralee there. Uh, and it's very strange when, complete strangers come up and tell you things about your own life that you've forgotten you might have said publicly. But I think that that level of trust is there, and people seem to
Mm.
have that little connection. And the same thing is very true of podcasts.
Yeah. Yeah.
Kind of when you're listening to somebody, I mean, it's literally it's a voice in your ear, and it becomes a friend.
Yeah, it's a very, I guess, intimate, maybe the wrong word, but it is like you're there. I mean, the other day, and we'll get on now to some of the things you've learned from working with brands on the podcast, but my wife was here and she had been out on a walk with the dog and she was listening to a podcast. She didn't even see me come into the kitchen. Didn't even see me. And next thing, I think it was one of these like thriller ones, and she got the fright of her life. And I was just like, what? Like what? And she goes, oh, I didn't even hear you, because she was so engrossed in the story and the storytelling. And, she literally had zoned out and she was doing stuff, but what was going on around her was phenomenal. So, in 5 words, what have you learned from working with brands?
I know you're laughing, and that's only because before we started that I spent basically I'll tell you what I have learned. I mean, we've been working with brands now I've been working with brands all my life through radio. And I've been working with brands specifically on podcasts for the last number of years. And I wanted to find out with brands and podcasts, what were the 3, 4, 5 things that really worked for everybody?
Yeah.
And I decided, well, how are we going to do this? So I searched the world for brands who had created award-winning podcasts and won awards from them. And because I figured, if they're at that very level and they've won gold, silver, or bronze for something, they're doing something right.
Yeah.
And what was it that all of those things have in common? And it came down to, and this is the 5 words, which I can expand a little bit about, but, and much of it you have explained with that little story with your wife in the kitchen. It's engagement, it's story, it's offering value to people, it's consistency, and it's time. They are the 5
Brilliant.
things that all of the award winners that we spoke to had in common for brand podcasts specifically.
That's sorry, and I love that because it reminds me. I love that you went to award winners, and people give awards and award winners a hard time, but it's where the likes of Peter Field went for his effectiveness work. He went and looked at the award winners because you can glean a lot from just understanding things that come through in those trends. So let's talk about each of those in terms of then engagement as a piece. Let's go into that a bit more deeply.
There's very few metrics that you can actually get a solid number on with podcasts. One of them is downloads, but another is engagement, because you're able to see with Google, with Apple, and with Spotify how long a person has listened to a podcast. And what we have found is that with podcasts, after somebody has heard about a podcast, they decided they want to listen to an episode, that they click play, and then they go off. And as you said, like with your wife, she decided to listen to a particular podcast. She pressed play. She went out for her walk, and that's what she's doing, and listening to the podcast at the same time. So people are less likely to turn off the podcast,
right,
because they're doing something else. But the engagement levels are very high. And if you were doing it right, you can get engagement levels of 80, 90, or 100%. People who are listening to the vast majority of your podcast. And most of the podcasts that we create for brands are 30, 40, 50 minutes long.
Yeah.
That's a lot of time to have somebody sitting in your ear talking. And that was definitely one of the things with all of the brand podcasts that we were talking to around the world. That engagement was something that they worked very hard on and succeeded in.
Okay. We move on from, I guess, engagement, because it's going to be linked to the next point, which is story, right? Because I guess you're not engaging people if you don't have a good story to tell.
That was one of the most important things and actually, I would say if there was one word that summed up all of the award winners, story is the one that they had. They were saying things to us like, people do amazing things. You just have to ask. That was the lady from the Flying Doctors podcast. Okay. There's a guy that we spoke to. He said, if people like your stories, well, they'll like your brand. We spoke to a law firm, and they said that the story comes first and the brand comes second. And this is what has worked for them. And I don't mean just like with winning awards or making great podcasts. These are podcasts that have generated business, and they do it because they put the story first. Because if people like your story, they will like your brand. And I thought it was really interesting. And some amazing stories. We did one of the award winners is Care Plus Pharmacy here in Ireland.
Yeah.
And they did a podcast, a niche pod. This is one of the things of podcasts is to go niche. And they did a podcast for women who were about to have a baby, but not just any baby. They were about to have their first baby.
Right.
Okay. And I remember one of the stories that stuck in my head in that particular podcast was they were recommending what to take to the labor ward. So you can kind of think, well, blah, 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 blah. And then things started coming out that you would never, ever think of. Like one of the things they said was to bring lip balm because it gets very dry in the hospital.
Right.
Another one was to bring a pair of big old comfy knickers. And another one was to bring a long lead for your phone.
Oh, right.
Into a maternity ward, worried about running out of power in their smartphone until, of course, you run out of power in your smartphone. So I thought these kind of little things, those little stories were terrific. The Flying Doctors podcast, I mean, that was just full of amazing stories. The whole point of their podcast was they wanted to make city dwellers and tourists in Australia aware of what can happen when you're out in the bush and when you're out in the outback.
Okay.
One of the stories they told was about a guy who ended up being attacked by a crocodile. He was out in the middle of nowhere, and the crocodile degloved his arm, which means that the crocodile literally took all of the skin off his arm.
Oh.
You could just see all the muscles and the blood and everything.
Never been a doctor.
He had to get into his Jeep and drive for a full hour before he met another human being, and then called the Flying Doctor. The guy is relating his story on the podcast. It's like magnetic. If you walked into the kitchen halfway through that story, you wouldn't frighten anybody because they wouldn't be paying any attention to you. And then there was another one from Shine Lawyers, and I loved because the guy making the podcast and the people that we spoke to, I should say, on the award winning series, they're all marketers. We didn't talk to the producers or anything like that. They're the marketing.
Okay,
Who
great.
saw that, well, I think podcasting could be useful as part of my marketing work. And this guy in Shine Lawyer says, and we interviewed the boss, and then he told this story, and I hated it, where one of his first cases was he took on McDonald's, this huge multinational corporation, and it was a big case, a lot of money on the table, and he lost.
Well,
And he keeps telling this story, and his point is actually a very good one. He says, until you've lost something as big as that, you're not a lawyer until you've lost.
brilliant.
Because you don't realize, kind of what you're missing out on. So kind of all of those little stories were being told in all of the various podcasts. So story is hugely important.
Something else you kind of touched on was each of the podcasts we talked about have had a very specific objective. Like they were trying to achieve something very specific.
Yes. And that's another thing that now it's not in my top 5.
Yeah.
Certainly one of the things that I noticed with the marketing people was they sat down and they kind of, because there was a bit of a tendency to go, oh, we make a podcast. Everybody's making a podcast. That's where to be. All of these award winners went, okay, well, there's obviously some use in podcasts and it could be very engaging, but where is this going to fit into our overall scheme?
Yeah.
And they would kind of look at, well, where are we going to use it? What's our goal? What part of our, overall strategy is this going to fulfill? Some of them would do very detailed internal research. Care Plus did an awful lot of stuff, and they talk about it in their episode of the podcast about what they did. But it was that kind of preparation, thinking, what is it about? Not just kind of running into it and to be,
we should be on
because it sounds like fun. I mean, it is fun. It can be fun. But they went in and they decided, they did their research. And I always say that to people, have your strategy, have your podcast strategy first.
Yeah.
Think about, well, what is it that I need? What is it going to achieve for me?
Yeah. I'm going to come back to that a bit later on because I think it's a very, very important point, but I want to touch on some of the other 5. So consistency was one of the other ones that you talked about.
Yes. Listen, this is very simple. They all said that their podcast worked because they showed up when they were consistent in when they published.
Right.
Okay. So like a lot of people, again, will jump into podcasts and they do like the first 4 or 5 episodes and they put them all out in one go within a month. And then there's nothing for 2 months. And then they add another episode. It gets very here. They said one of the things that worked was consistency, where you publish every single week or you publish every second week.
Yeah.
And you just show up and you are always there and you are guaranteed.
Yeah. And it's okay. It's a great point as well. It's okay to, pre-record and have, 6 in the bank ready to go. And that's kind of, whatever number of weeks or months that you want that to spread out over. I think I would agree with you there.
But it's like EastEnders, it's on at the same time every night for a reason. Coronation Street, the news at 9:00. It's always on at 9:00. If you have that consistency and then and I know this from radio, you become part of people's weekly lives.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting when you think about it, and it's always worth thinking about some of the really big ones, when you hear, our next episode is coming next Tuesday and you're literally going, I actually can't wait for that. Like it's, that's, we may not all get to that, but like that is kind of almost the ambition, but it is, it's kind of that looking forward. But again, the joy of podcasts, I would forget now who was saying either I listened to it or read it somewhere that they stopped doing other types of interviews and focused a lot of their effort on podcast interviews because the content was always available. So if they did something that was live, it was, unless, it was harder to find and harder to get out there, but they always knew their story would be available on a podcast. So again, that's another great advantage of kind of the value of doing podcasts. Time. You are listening to That's What I Call Marketing, in partnership with the Indie List, where you will find experienced and vetted marketing talent, people like me, and also people who design and people who write. You get the idea. Check out theindielist.ie.
You are listening to That's What I Call Marketing. Do you need help growing your business through marketing? Well, check out our services at that'swhaticallmarketing.com. Get in touch today and see how we can help.
Time. That was another one that surprised me, because they said that they needed to give the podcast time. Because again, like, when you're starting on a new project, you want to conquer the world, and you want to conquer the world immediately. Whereas with a podcast or anything that's kind of deep or anything that's engaging at that level, it needs time to grow. And I always think of The Shawshank Redemption, like everybody's favorite movie. All right. Absolutely tanked in the cinemas when it came out. Okay. And it was only afterwards on DVD and then VHS and whatever else that it grew. And Breaking Bad was another TV series that started out like, it's kind of, these things kind of just need time. But when they are given the time to grow, they can grow into something enormous.
Yeah.
And that's what all of these podcasts did. And the producers were saying to me that the time was to grow, but the time was also for them to grow. And the time was also for them to kind of like suss out, well, what is it exactly that the audience wants?
Right.
Because quite often you'll go, people would love this. And then actually they want something else completely different.
Yeah.
But you learn this and you give the public what the public wants, as Paul Weller would say. And you learn that way. But they all gave a year. And when we're working with clients now, we will only work with a client for a year.
Right.
Right. Well, I mean, for a minimum of a year, because you need to give it, like, even if it's only 12 monthly episodes or something like that, or if it's something that's every second week, but you need to give it that time in order to let the audience grow, let you to find out what the podcast is about, what is the content that really works. If you're going to be doing some of the podcast work yourself in-house, there's skills that you will have to learn. You need to develop a workflow, a flow of guests and interesting content and all that. But all of these award winners, and again, like, kind of they're successful podcasts outside of just being at awards, and they all generated business for their various brands, but they all gave it time.
Great. And actually some of this has got a couple of other questions related to that, but I want to get to the fifth one. And then I have a few more specific questions about maybe when brands should start thinking about it. But your last one, am I right, was value. Did I catch that right?
Value. Yes. Yeah. If you want to have a successful podcast, you need to be giving value to people. Why would people listen to you if you're not giving them information that they can use and they can actually put into use in their life? So value is a huge thing. The Lawyers podcast, the way they did it, I thought was really nice, was they had a client talking about the problem that they had, and they would relate their story. And then afterwards, the lawyer would come on and say, well, this is what the law says in this. So anybody listening, and you're building up a bank of content with that. So if the adoption story, I think I mentioned, if somebody is looking for their birth parents and is having difficulty and they're looking through this podcast and they find that story, and this is what was happening over and over, right? They would find that story and they would listen to it and they go, oh my God, that is so me. And I've learned so much and now I know what I need to do. And they get on the phone, they call the law firm, and they don't say, I need help with, they go, I want to talk to Michael.
Right.
The specific lawyer, because they feel he's the person who's going to help.
Connection.
The two most important reasons why people listen to podcasts, right? And they are level pegging, all right? This is amazing, right? Entertainment. So Peter Crouch and listen to stories and crime stories and murders, all that kind of, all very popular. Entertainment, right, is one. But equally, all right, 48% of people listen to podcasts because for entertainment reasons. 48% of people also listen to podcasts for educational reasons.
Right. Yeah.
To learn something or to be inspired. And if you have a podcast that's actually giving value, well then, I mean, you're in there with one of the top reasons for listening to podcasts.
Yeah. I was curious as you went through these award winners, who were the presenters? You mentioned the lawyer was the lawyer. Like, were the presenters all internal people? Did they bring people in? How did they go about that?
They were generally internal people.
Right.
My experience and the experience again with all of these award winners is authenticity is a major factor in the success of a podcast.
Okay.
So you can be a brand and you can kind of say, I know some brands are very into their personality. Oh, we want blah, 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 rugby player in, or we want blah, 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 TV person. But that person may not know anything about the topic.
Yeah.
And if they don't know anything about the topic, well, then they could be missing out on something huge. So, and then also there's just an authenticity and a knowledge there that works. And I always say to our clients, I say, we're there to make you sound good, and we're
Right.
there to train you and to help you. And, if you're reading an introduction to them, people go, oh, but I'm reading it. And I go, well, nobody cares if you're reading it,
Mm.
because you're not wasting the person's time. You're conveying the information and you get right into the content that people will find valuable as quickly as possible. So you don't need that polish. The authenticity is way more important. And that absolutely shines through with all of the award winners we spoke to.
So I guess one of the questions I've had and thinking about this today, and if a brand is listening to this today going, yeah, I've thought we should do podcasts. What are some things they need to think about? Not necessarily in terms of kind of the logistical side. I think you can get to that, but like, why would I do a podcast over sponsoring a podcast that is in my area? Like, as an example, because it's a big lift. Like it is it takes time, effort. We talked about all those things. So it'd be good to get your view on the why.
You can sponsor a show, but you have no control over the content of that show or who's presenting it or how they may behave. We've seen all that left, right, and center. You've no control over what's happening within the show. With your own branded podcast, you absolutely have 100% control. If you're sponsoring a podcast, you get 30 or 60 seconds. You can just play a radio ad, on a medium as intimate as podcasting, that is getting such high attention levels. Just throw in a radio ad. It doesn't really work.
Yeah.
What works very well is host-read announcements. But if the host gets what you do, well, then it's magic. It literally is magic. But quite often the host doesn't get what you do.
Right.
And they're just reading a script or something, and it just sounds false. When you have your own brand podcast, you control the content 100%. And actually, you may not be hitting the same kind of huge numbers. This, again, is something that we found in real life. You don't hit the huge numbers that you might get if you're, sponsoring the Tommy Tiernan podcast or something like that. But every single person who does download and listen to your podcast gets what it is that you do.
Right.
And they want to know more about what it is that you do. You're telling the story related to what it is that you do. And if people like your story, they will buy into your brand.
So it's not necessarily reach. You're not doing it to reach a large audience necessarily.
No, podcasting is all about quality.
Yeah.
Engagement and quality. That's what it's about.
And then, so I suppose getting it out there, I mean, you can, do all the good stuff, understand your strategy, know your story, know what you want to get across, have that kind of specific objective. I think these are all really important things. And once you get it out there, how do you get it out there? Because, if a tree falls in the wood.
Well, that's another thing that we spoke to. No, yes, true too. But that's another thing that we spoke to all of our award winners on our podcast series about. And we said kind of, how did you get the word out there? It's one of my standard questions. Like, you've put all this effort in.
Yeah,
how do you tell the world about it? Like, and they came back with some really good things. Consistency was one of the things they said, because if you're there every week, you're building an audience every week, and people are able to say, oh, I found this thing, and there's always something new and something going on. Publishing frequency is very important. Okay. I kind of look at the frequency of publishing in three ways. If you're going to do a podcast once a month, it's good for building content. If you're going to publish a podcast that's out every 2 weeks or so, it's good for thought leadership. If you're going to publish a podcast every week, it's brilliant for brand authority. They're the three things. And that's what the award winners did. For promoting it, they would use every channel they had at their disposal. Yeah. Okay. And they would do it consistently. They wouldn't just go, boom, we've got a new podcast on all of the social channels, and then never talk about it again. They would have it as, kind of front and center on their website. They would be constantly talking about what's in the latest issue, or the latest episode, I should say, on their socials. A number of them would use in stores. So they would have posters in store. Gotcha. They would have a little QR code on the poster, so people just scan their phone and it goes right into their podcast app.
And in terms of then, I'm getting into some of the logistical things, do you have to have editing skills? Do you have to have presenting skills? Is that where, have to be in-house? Do you have to have a studio?
Well, no, look, there's many ways to skin a cat, all right?
Yeah, yeah.
One or two of the marketing people had previously had journalistic experience, okay? So they were able to do a little bit of editing, or they were able to craft the story better. Others had no idea. Others knew how to do it, but just didn't have the time. So they would use an external producer. I would say probably about 60, maybe 70% of them used an external producer to some extent. But
Yeah.
a lot of them did a lot of the work in-house as well. Um, I'm trying to think, I can't remember which interview it was, but it was the person saying that, okay, so this is a podcast. It was a first for our company. It was a first for our industry. And I just thought, my name is riding on this. People are going to be looking at me. My boss is going to be looking at me. My
Yeah.
industry is going, I can't just jump on YouTube and do a quick course on how to edit audio. I need somebody who knows what they're doing, and this is what you find with external, because this is what they do. They make podcasts.
Yeah,
The stuff, like I know it myself, the stuff in my head that I don't even think about because it's just part of my professional, what I do.
Yeah. Yeah. And even getting to your Corey Highland, who a lot of people know, kind of talks about your core story, like just extracting that piece is really valuable and worthwhile investing time in that, and kind of getting the expertise, and of course our friends at the Indie List who can help, and you're there to help. You've touched on some great things. Like, I think really people having a very clear reason for doing, it's like anything in marketing. What's a reason for doing this? Like, what's the job to be done? What are your objectives? What can you achieve? Probably not chasing the numbers, and lucky this is a very authentic way of getting that message out to a group of people that care. And I think, it's that time of year where people are thinking about next year, thinking about planning, and how, maybe a podcast becomes part of their marketing mix. Are there any things people should watch out for if they're going into that planning phase?
I would say talk to a podcast producer.
Right.
And just get information. Get information, get ideas, and then make your decision. If it's something that can definitely help, podcasting will definitely be a very positive influence on your overall marketing campaign. I would often explain to people that if you are, when you're running an event in a hotel and you need to get 100 people in there, the trouble you have to go to, organize the hotel, entertainment, food, drinks, send out invites, get people to come along. Do you know what I mean? You do that with a podcast, no problem. And it sits there forever.
Yeah.
So that months down the line, there's more people coming in and seeing the same show. It's like doing a show for a stand-up comedian. Any of them would be loved to be in the Laughter Lounge and have 300 people there, watching their routine. If you had 300 people listening to your podcast, do you know what I mean? And, the cost effectiveness is amazing. And the engagement that it delivers is amazing. And as I say, it's all about quantity.
It's a great comparison, and if you were doing an event and you were trying to get 100 people at it, like a heavy lift, you'd spend 6 months planning it and organizing it, and the cost and the logistical nightmare. And, I think it's a great way of kind of looking at it, like, what's the value of that audience? And I, for the first time somebody mentioned to me when I was working with our Australian marketing team at Indeed, and a guy there, Jay Monroe, said, "Oh, we'd like to do a podcast." And I'll be honest, my initial reaction was like, really, Jay? Like, and all the questions we brought up here now is like, why? Like, what's it going to do? And he was very clever. He was like, look, we have a group of people that we want to engage with that are decision makers that can help make a decision whether to use us in their business or not. And we really struggle to get them to come to our event or to just take a call from anybody. If I can bring them in and interview them, not about what we do at Indeed, but what they do and their thought leadership and their views on the future of work and all that kind of stuff, it's going to build an engagement. And that's exactly what happened. It's exactly what happened.
Yeah, exactly. And I hear that with successful podcasts over and over and over again. That kind of thing where they're resonating with other people. And when you do that, the business just comes. It's like, I'm not a salesperson. I don't like sales, but podcasting is kind of like, it's just such an effective sales machine. I
Yeah.
have found it anyway. And I've seen it with all of the award winners that we spoke to on our podcast as well.
Brilliant. Dusty, listen, thank you so much for taking me through all that. I know you're putting out a series on kind of these.
Yes, basically we've just put it, if you want to find it, just get into your podcasting app and just search for Award Winners Dust Pod, and it'll pop up. And essentially for our first series, we have 7 people from Australia, from Canada, from the UK, from Ireland. They are all marketing managers. They're not podcast creators, they're marketing managers, branding people. The one thing that they all have in common is the podcast projects that they did all won awards. So that's why Award Win is the title. And Dust
Brilliant.
Pod.
Brilliant. So award winners Dust Pod. That's a great look. That's a great way to start, a place to start. If you're thinking about this as a vehicle, part of your marketing mix for your organization, listen to what the award winners say, and then, it's a great way to start. Dusty, thanks so much. Great to chat. Thanks for all your support. Just for anyone listening, Dusty's been amazing. Always answering questions I have about, doing things or when I'm stuck or no, and you're fantastic. So I genuinely appreciate that. You've been so generous. So I really appreciate it.
Oh, no, you're welcome. Look, it's good for everybody. Good podcasts out in the world is just, it's a good thing. That's my passion.
Well, look, and there you go. It's about the passion. So yeah, keep it going. Dusty, thanks a million.
You're welcome.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that episode with brilliant Dusty Rhodes. I mean, with a name like that, he had to end up on radio. Oh, look, I know. I hope you got some great insights there. It was brilliant that Dusty had gone and dug into the award-winning database. It is a great source of information. And not only that, he's gone out and he's spoken to the award winners. Great place to start. Go find his award winners, Secrets award-winning brand podcast, and just search dustpod.io. And I think it was great to get those 5 key elements that you need to think about. There's lots more, but of course, listening to these award winners and thinking about it and really understanding, I think for me, the key is like, why are you doing this? What's the objective? And, how is it going to help your overall marketing mix? Of course, it is a brilliant way to get across incredible, powerful storytelling and creating great value for an audience about something that you and they care about. Well, that is it for today's episode of That's What I Call Marketing. Thank you so much for listening or watching. Of course, if you have enjoyed today's episode, please do share it. Subscribe wherever you're listening or watching so you know when our next episode lands. You can follow us on social media. That's What I Call Marketing, or Twitter X, that's _marketing. And of course, if we can help you with your growth through marketing, visit that'swhaticallmarketing.com and see how we can help. Thanks again to the Indie List for their support of this show. If you need experienced, excellent marketing talent, go to theindielist.ie. Don't go anywhere else. theindielist.ie.